Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Oracle Apex, What Every DBA Needs to Know with our CTO, Francis Mignault. Just some housekeeping before we get started, and I pass over to Francis. I'll be your moderator and host today. My name is Jason. I also work at INSOM. If you have any difficulties with sound or any technical issues, feel free to send me a message during the webinar. We can sort it out. As for questions, feel free to also ask questions throughout the webinar. We'll be addressing them all at the end. So feel free to send them anytime you do have a question, but we'll let Francis go throughout his presentation, and we'll take all the questions at the end. Also, for anyone who's curious, there will be a recording available after the webinar. We'll send it to everyone on this list probably a week after the webinar. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Francis, and enjoy the webinar, everyone.
All right, thank you, Jason. So, hi everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar, which is a webinar targeted more towards DBAs and, of course, about Oracle Apex. So, a little bit about myself. I'm a CTO and co-founder of INSOM Solutions. I've been working with Oracle databases for close to 30 years now. Started with Oracle Forms 1.6 back in the days in 86, 87. And after that, I became a DBA over time. And 13 years ago, when Apex came out in 2004, I was installing Oracle 10G. And I installed something called HTML-DB. At the time, that was Apex. It was from on the companion CD, and that's how I got introduced to Apex, and I've been doing that since then. I co-wrote two books. The latest one is Oracle Application Express Administration, and in this book you'll find pretty much everything I'll be talking about today in more details. It's really also targeted towards DBAs and developers that want to know more about, how to manage and administer Apex. If you want to talk to me or reach out to me, you can do that through Twitter. You can see my Twitter account there, FR4NCIS, and there's an hashtag called ORCL Apex. If you follow that hashtag, you'll learn a lot about, or can talk to the community about Oracle Apex also. And if you don't know what coffee fee is, then it's time for you to get on Twitter and learn more about that. I'm also the content chair for Kscope 17 this year, and I was last year for database and Apex, and I'll talk about that in a moment. INSOM is a dedicated Apex company. We do all kinds of things with Apex, training, coaching, custom development, and we have offices in Canada, in the US, and also in Peru. So if you want to learn more about INSOM, just go on our website and you'll get all the info on that. So Kscope, I have to talk about this. There's a conference this June 25th to 29th. It's going to be in San Antonio this year. This is a really good conference for Apex content. There's over 50 sessions, hands-on labs, and the Oracle Apex team is also going to be on site. But there's also a good track for DBAs and database developers, also over 50 tracks, and well-known speakers are going to be there also. So I invite you to go check that out. The website is kscope17.com, and if you register and enter the code INSOM, you'll save $100. So what's Apex? For those of you who don't know what Apex is, basically Apex is a database tool that comes with the Oracle database. and it's used to develop desktop and mobile applications. It's a web application development framework. It's all browser-based, and you can use that free of charge. It's part of your Oracle database licensing, and you can use it also for runtime and for development purposes. If you want to know more about Apex, you can go on apex.oracle.com, which is a free Oracle Cloud. You can create a workspace there and try it out for yourself. Some use cases for Apex, you can build small applications. There's even packaged application that comes with a tool, but you can also use it for enterprise critical applications. We also use it quite a lot now for extending EBS, for example, and other ERPs. And you can use it to modernize older applications or centralize your information in the database. It could be either, conversion from Access to Oracle or Excel spreadsheets or Lotus Notes or things like that. Okay, so the webinar today is about what every DBA needs to know about Oracle Application Express. And the way I built this session is based on some frequently asked questions I get from DBAs and from different clients and when I present at different conferences. So I'll go through those 10 different questions, some of them. There's obviously more than 10, but I picked the one that have been asked more frequently. So one that comes up quite often is, what do I need? I need to run Apex. What does it need? Is it complicated? Do I need different pieces, different software? Is it secure? Because I heard that it's in the database. People will access my database. Can I install that in my production environment, for example? How do users connect to that database? Because I don't want every user to come into my database, right? Can Apex handle high volumes? Can it treat a lot of transactions? Is it fast? I heard that, a lot of people heard that it's for small applications, but can it scale, basically? If I want to open this up to mobile applications or external applications, how do I do that, right? What about the backups? What do I need to back up as a DBA? That's probably the first thing you're wondering. You want to make sure everything's going to be there and going to be able to recover in case of a problem. So how do I back up my applications and my Apex instance? How do I avoid, if someone does something crazy in an application, how do I avoid getting my whole database down on its knees? What can I do to make it so it doesn't happen, since everybody runs in the database? And this one is, I want to use it with eBusiness Suite. I'm a DBA. What are the advantages of using Apex over Forms or OAF? And how does that install in an eBusiness Suite environment? Also, another question I get is, now there's 12, on 12C, there's PDBs and CDBs. Is there anything I have to be aware of or be careful with? And of course, the cloud options. And you'll see Apex has been cloud enabled since day one, even before Oracle was offering cloud. Apex is a very good tool for the cloud, and I'll go over that later on. And last but not least, how do I monitor my sessions? Because it's tough. All I see is sessions on Apex public user that goes in my database. How do I know what's going on with Apex? So what I did is I took all those 10 questions and I created 8 different sections, and I'll go over each sections throughout the webinar. So the first section is about the architecture. what you need to install and how it's working and what components are required for Apex to run. How do I install or upgrade Apex? Of course, backups. I'll talk about Resource Manager and Apex, but I'll talk about monitoring, some administration tips and tricks, a quick overview of EBS integration, more on the DBA side of things, so how does that installs in the database and with the web listener. I'll be talking about Apex in the cloud, and that's it. So let's start with the architecture. So there's really two big components that you need when you run an Apex installation. The first one is you need a web listener to make your connection from your web browser to your Apex engine. So that web listener can be either EPG, OHS, or ORDS, and I'll get back to that in a second. And the other component is the Oracle database. So in the Oracle database, you'll have the Apex repository. So on that graph, when you see the Apex 05000, that's the metadata for Apex. And you'll also have your application schemas as you would with any other tools, for example, like forms or other tools that access the database to put your application tables and packages and objects. So as you see in this graph, there's a pool of connection between the web listener and the database. And this connection pool will be using a user called Apex public user. So that user has to be unlocked, and I'll talk about that in a second. Connection are not continuous to the database, meaning that those are stateless connection. And the Apex session will be using the connection just for the time for rendering and processing the page, and after that it lets it go. So it's really scalable, because then you can have a lot of users and a lot of connections, since they're only used for processing and rendering of the page. You can see also on the right, to access my application schema, there's a sys package called DBMS sys SQL. So the connection goes through Apex public user, but then depending on the schema or the application, Apex gonna switch and dynamically access the data from that schema using the DBMS sys SQL. So everything going through is dynamic, even though that looks like it will take a lot of time or CPU to do so. It's actually very fast. So the overhead, a lot of people are asking about the overhead of Apex. There's really no overhead, and one of the reasons is, I think, it's that it's running straight from the database. So there's, on the application side, application server side, the web listener doesn't do anything really. It just it takes the request, validates it, puts it back to the database, and then render the results back to the web browser. So it's very, very fast. So your middle tier, where your application tier is actually in the database itself. So it makes it so that Oracle has a clear overview, a clear view of everything, your applications, the Apex metadata, and your data at the same time, so it can optimize everything pretty quickly. So there's no back and forth between the application server and the database server. The other big advantage is, if ever there's a failure, or if you want to do highly transaction and have a load balancer in front, and you want to use your web listener, multiple web listeners, you don't have to worry about sessions. Sessions are all handled in the Apex metadata. So that being said, when you need to deploy things or you need to install an Apex application, you'll have to deploy images, CSS, and JavaScripts, and that can be put on the Apex listener side, the web listener. Your application will be in the metadata, so Apex generates the application dynamically. There's no executable. Everything's stored into the Apex repository. And then you'll have your application database objects as any other application, web applications. About the web listener, we highly recommend you use ORDS, which is Oracle REST Data Services. That is also free. You can download that from OTN. Using ORDS will give you more Apex features, and there's a lot of features in Apex that works only if you have ORDS. You can use EPG, for example, if you use Oracle Express. By default, EPG will be turned on, but we still recommend, even with Oracle XC, to use ORDS all the time. If you already have an old installation of Apex and using Oracle HTTP server or OHS, I strongly recommend that you go to ORDS. It's a lot faster and it's a lot easier to maintain. So ORDS, it's installed immediately. It's a Java program. You can deploy that either on WebLogic, Glassfish, or Tomcat. Those three application servers are fully supported by Oracle. So if you have any issues or anything, Oracle will support you with those. It's very light. It's very easy to deploy. It's free, so you can download that from OTN. And there's also you can use it also just to do web services outside of Apex if you want to. Once everything, your ORDS is installed and everything, you'll see in the database three different schemas that will be installed with Apex. So I've talked about Apex Public User already. You need to keep this one unlocked and make sure it is, because that's your entry point in the database. And please don't give any privileges to that user to avoid security issues or anything. It's been made for that, and you should not grant anything else. You should keep the minimal privileges that comes with it. One thing that happens sometimes with some clients is that when this is being created, there's a profile with the expiration for the password. Just make sure that this doesn't happen, because your Apex install is going to work for a while and then suddenly nothing's going to work because this user will be locked or the password will be expired and Apex will stop working. So just a FYI here. The Apex schemas, you actually have two schemas, one called Apex underscore and the release of Apex. So in that case, 050100 is 5.1. If you have 5.0, for example, 5.0 installed, you'll have Apex underscore 050000 in schema in your database. And there's another database schema called flows files, and this one is used by Apex to keep files, of course. So those two you can keep locked. You don't have to worry about passwords or anything. Apex will manage those and will use them even if they're locked or if you change the password. On the application side, when you have an Apex application, the Apex application, they have to be assigned to a database schema. So if you look at the bottom here, I have database schema A, B, C, and D. So those are standard Oracle database users, and we call them schemas because you'll have tables in them and packages. And then when you create an application, you need to assign one schema to your application. So one application is based on one and only one database schema. The application, for example, application 1 can be assigned to schema A, for example. As you can see, this is an old graph. I still have HTML VB, but it's the same as Apex. Then applications are installed into what we call the workspace. Workspace is a logical entity that groups applications together. So you can restrict the schemas accessible to one workspace. For example, I could create an HR workspace and give only access to HR database schemas. So that way, if a developer work with Apex, all you'll be able to work on will be those database schemas. So it's a way to group your applications together and a way to manage security towards the database itself. And then the workspace 1, for example, will not be able to access a schema C unless I do grants at the database level or things like that. And finally, developer users will be accessing Apex by logging into a workspace. And those users are not database users. They're really strictly application users. So Apex can have users as developers. They could be workspace administrators, or they could be runtime only users. So your application can be using the Apex users if you would like to, but you can also use Active Directory, an Oracle table, or other things like that to manage your application's users. So it's very important to understand that you don't need a database user for each user you're using. It's really application users. That doesn't have anything to do with database users. And you'll see later on when you monitor, you're able to get to the developer user name and then monitor your database, and that way know which application, which database schema is being used, which user is being used, so on and so forth. Still part of the architecture. One of the questions I mentioned earlier is that how do I open my installation to external users? So in that case, let's say I have a mobile application which access my application, my Apex. It's an Apex application, and then it's stored in my database. So there must be some way of people outside of my network to be able to connect and use that application on the mobile. So the way we do this is we use a configuration called a reverse proxy. So you see here in the DMZ, I have an Apache server. It could be other web servers. You keep it minimal, and then you can control. You can filter by IP, by URLs. You can implement HTTPS. You can change your firewall rules. For example, we did a web service going through a DMZ, opened it up to a specific external server with their IP address, and we were able to make sure that only this external IP address was able to access our internal Apex application or internal web service. You can also set up a VPN tunnel. So we do also have clients using VPN on their phones to access Apex applications. If you want to know more about this setup, you can. There's more details in the book, the Apex administration book. But I just wanted to mention that because that's a question we get quite often. Okay, now about installing and upgrading, and that's pretty straightforward. So Apex runs on any versions of editions of the database. So from Oracle Express, XC, Standard Edition 2 now, Standard Edition, Enterprise Edition, and all the cloud offerings also. So because Apex is actually really tables, packages, and functions, and it's a metadata and PL SQL, then it runs on any versions of the database. And the great thing about this is if you take an application from, for example, Oracle Standard Edition, and then you just import into Enterprise Edition, you'll be able to right away use the Enterprise Edition features or options that you have, so without doing anything. So because Apex, again, as you saw earlier, runs in the database, you can run any kind of features. It could be Oracle text, it could be advanced security, everything. You have access to the whole database. Character set of your database should now be always UTF-8, of course. We had some cases where we used to use in North America the 8859P1, and we had some issues. So just again, as a FYI, now we use Windows 1252 because it runs in Windows, and there's some special characters, and it's pretty easy to upgrade this character set to the other one. But every new database and every new applications, we now always use UTF-8, AL32 UTF-8, I think it's called now. When you install Apex, you need to install it as sys. It's a simple script, and I'll be talking about that in a second. And please create a separate table space for your Apex install. Do not use sysaux. By default, the documentation mentions sysaux because it's a table space that's always there. But please put that in a separate table space. It's way much easier to maintain and follow and make sure that everything runs normally and perfectly. It's a free download, so no cost option. You must have a valid database license. If you want to get the patches, you also need, of course, access to support.oracle.com. That's where all the patches are. But that's it. So to be able to run as a runtime and develop with it, you need a database license. So it's part of your Oracle database licensing. It used to be when you would create a new instance, it used to create an Apex for you, and you would see, if you look at your databases now, you would see an Apex 04 probably, depending on the release of the Oracle you have. But those schema I was talking about earlier, they're probably there in your databases right now. But the thing is, there's really a much faster release cycle of Apex than the database release cycle. So now starting from 12.2, Apex is not with the Oracle binaries. You get the Apex binaries, but you should always download the latest version from OTN to make sure you have the latest release on hand. Like I said, even though 12.2 just came out, at 5.1.1 now, Apex is the latest release, and there's probably be other releases soon. So it's always better to have the latest version of Apex. When you download Apex, if you want to do multilingual, there's actually two downloads. One which is English only. The other one is all languages, which includes 10 different languages out of the box to develop with Apex and run Apex with. It's actually one apex.zip file. Just make sure that when you download your zip file, keep it with your database so you'll have the correct binaries for Apex for whatever is installed in your database. For example, I'll be showing backup scripts. Those utilities are for a specific version, so it's good to have your versions of Apex or the version running with a database somewhere on your disks, and you can relate to it, because it's not only for installing, but it's for maintenance afterwards also. There's a lot of scripts and utilities in the zip file. So installing is pretty straightforward, and of course, if you read the documentation, there's a lot of steps that you need to go through, take a backup of a database, for example, and so on and so forth, and make sure you have all the prerequisites and everything. But essentially, it's one SQL script that you need to run to install Apex. The most common one is the Apex INS script. And if you want to run that on a CDB and a PDB, the script will know and it will do the correct installation for you. So the Apex INS script is the standard installation. But you can also run Apex as a runtime only installation, which means Apex is going to be installed, the engine is going to be there, your application will run, but you will not have the builder installed. So that could be useful in very highly secured production environment. And having the runtime only, then you can use APIs to install and manage your instance. And I'll be talking about that a bit later on. And then you have scripts that installs the builder and removes the builder. So DV installs development tool install, and dev remove is removing it. So you can add it back, remove it, and so on and so forth. And of course, there's a script to remove Apex completely, or you simply drop the schemas. So installing Apex, also there's basically another step that needs to be done at the web listener level. So now that you run the script on the database and install the Apex engine, which will create those database schemas I've talked about earlier, then you need to copy the Apex images on your web server. Because Apex has been built using Apex technology, well, it's basically installing Apex is basically like deploying in a web application. So every images and JavaScript required by Apex needs to be deployed on the web server. So you configure ORDS, and then you create your database connection, and you define where your images are in ORDS, and there you go. You're ready to go. So again, two pieces that you need to install: the database part and the web listener part. Upgrading. Well, if you want to find out what Apex version you're running, either go on the builder and you'll see a bottom right, or you can run this SQL on the DBA registry, and it's going to tell you which version is running. You can look at your DBA users list, and if you see the schema that has the IR release number with Apex underscore, will give you a good idea on the version of it. Because you can patch like 050100, it's not going to tell you which patch you have installed for 5.1, right? But it's going to tell you at least you're running 5.1. So it's essentially the same thing as installing. Upgrading Apex is if you have 5.0, for example, and you want to upgrade to 5.1, you just run the same Apex install script, and it's going to do everything for you and upgrade your version. Patches are a bit different. They're really like database patches. So you have a patch script, and then you just download the patch, and it's going to patch Apex for you. And usually they're pretty easy to run and simple to install. One thing I have to say is we've been upgrading a lot of Apex instances over the years, and we never had any major issues ever at all. So it's pretty simple. I think the Apex team makes a great job at making sure that the upgrades are very easy and works very well. And we've done that with from older version to recent versions, and you don't have to install every releases of Apex, by the way. So let's say you have Apex 3.1 and you want to go to Apex 5, you just run the 5 script, and then it's going to upgrade everything for you. You don't have to go through any other releases to go to the latest one. One just little tip here is that every new release of Apex have images, different images, and maybe different JavaScripts and stuff like that. So we recommend that you either keep a copy of the old Apex images in case you need to revert back, or create a new directory and use this new directory with the new release of Apex, just to make it easier. And another little tip is if you create custom applications and custom images, please don't put them in the same directory, because when you upgrade, you'll lose them. So make sure that your custom application images are stored in a separate directory. So the way upgrade works is if you run an install script, it's going to keep the old version and create another schema like I've talked about, and then it's going to export and import all of your application in the new repository, and then you'll be done. So if ever there's a problem right after the upgrade, you can always, there's in the documentation it explains how, but you can always downgrade and point back to the old repository. So the way we do it, usually we do the upgrade, run the script, install the latest release, make sure everything runs perfectly, and then maybe after a week or two, we drop the old Apex schemas. So that's going to give you a bit more space, and you don't need them anymore. Just make sure you never ever remove the Apex public user and the flows files, because those two are being used across versions of Apex. Of course, if you reinstall another release, you need to do all the post-install scripts, and if you're running on multiple languages, you need to reinstall those languages in the new install. I've had situations where installing Apex, the table space got full or there were some issues. You can actually rerun the script without any issues, so just so you're aware of it. It's also, they did a good job at setting the install script, so that's not an issue. Never had major issues installing Apex at all. One thing you have to be aware of is when you upgrade, all your applications will be upgraded at once. So there's only one version of Apex running per database instance. So if you're moving and you're installing Apex 5.1, then all your application will be upgraded to 5.1, just something to be aware of. So if you want to test your things before, then we propose or suggest that you create a test environment and import your applications there, make your tests, make sure everything runs good, and then do it in production, test and dev. Yeah. So that's it about upgrades. Once you finish the installation or the upgrade, then you need to configure your Apex instance. So to do so, there is a workspace that is used for administrators. So most of the time it's the DBA that does this job. It might not be, but usually where we go, we see that it's the DBA being in charge of that. So the internal workspace, there's a script in the Apex zip files under utilities, and it's not under utilities, under the build scripts. That's called APX chpwd. That's will set the admin password for internal. So if ever you lose that password, just simply run that script as sys, and it's going to reset your password for admin internal. So when you connect with admin internal, you'll get a different UI than the builder. In this UI, in this application, you'll be able to manage your instance, set the email SMTP, create new workspaces, manage Apex users, and monitor the activity of your Apex instance. So that's what you need to know once you install the Apex. Again, in the book, I have a whole chapter on Apex configuration where I go over the major parameters and configurations of Apex. I'm not going to go through that here, but so you know. And if you're new to Apex, that's good to know. That's something that any DBA needs to know about. Another thing about installation, and I'll go a bit faster, CDBs versus PDBs. You can install Apex in a CDB or PDB, and in some cases it's already installed in CDB. But now it's recommended to install Apex in the PDB, in the pluggable database, not at the CDB level, not at the container level. Why? Because it's a lot easier to maintain, then you'll have one version of Apex per pluggable databases. Be aware also that if you have Apex installed already in the CDB or in the PDB, there are multiple scenarios if you move PDBs from one CDB to another one. And those list them there, but there's actually a documentation, great documentation that Oracle did that explains all the different scenarios when you move from Apex in the CDB to Apex in the PDB and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go over that, but I just wanted to mention that that's something to be aware of, and that's something that you need to know about if you're working with multi-tenant Oracle 12. There's, I would like to just mention that there's an open source called Oscar. This is from Aura Open Source. It's a good tool that you can use to install Apex, Oracle Express, Apex, ORDS, SQL, AOP, Node.js with the use of only one build.sh script. If you want to know more, let me know, or go on GitHub. I have the URL there, and you'll get all the information. But basically, within 20-25 minutes, you'll get a full running Apex installation using Oracle Express. So you can do that on your own servers. You can do that on any cloud service. If you attended one of my sessions, I do that on Oracle and on DigitalOcean, for example, or even on the Google Cloud, because it's Oracle Express, so there's no licensing involved. But really, if you're a DBA and want to create demo setups, demo installations, or quickly have an Apex up and running, that's something to have a look at. I'm not going to go through the steps, but it's basically very simple. You download all the installation scripts, and then you set up the configuration file and you run the build script. Basically, that's how it works. And once you run your Oscar installation, then you access your Apex installation just by using the IP address, and you'll be able to log into Apex. Just a reminder, the Aura open source, if you do any Apex at all, that's something, a website you should know about and you should go to. There's different tools there. For example, there's one called Apex Diff. Apex Diff is used to compare different applications. And there's one called, it's a security tool called Apex Cert. And it's open source, so I really encourage you to go and have a look at Aura open source. Backups. So what do I need to back up when I do Apex? Well, it's pretty straightforward. And again, that's why we love Apex, is because for DBA, there's nothing really new to learn about. It's standard stuff. So you need to back up your database, you need to back up your images, and of course you need to back up your applications. What tool do we use for that? Well, you can use RMAN for your database, and that stays the same. You don't have to do anything. And by the way, if you're using a Stanberry database or DataGuard, you also don't have to do anything. Everything is database based, so everything's going to be copied for you. And so there's a failover. You don't have to worry about sessions or anything. Sessions are maintained at the database level in a database table by Apex. So you don't have to worry about that. If you use data pumps or database exports, it does not export the Apex repository, so be aware of that. You cannot restore Apex by importing the Apex 050100. It's not going to work. So you need to back up your application separately than the database, unless you have a full, complete backup, like an RMAN full. So exporting applications, there's a script for that. It's called Apex Export.class. It's a Java program that you can script So what we do, for example, for our dev environments, every night we export all the application there is in the database instance, and we check that into either SVN or any source file management tool. And then if ever a developer drops a page or drops an application by mistake, then we have a copy of the day before. So you do that by script. So what this is going to do is essentially the same as if you would go into the Apex builder and click export. That's going to do the exact same thing. It's going to create a .SQL file for you, and you can export different things. You can export applications, but you can also export workspace definitions, application feedbacks, things like that. So that's really something to know about. And like I mentioned before, this is in the apex.zip file that you downloaded to install Apex itself. There's a directory called utilities, and this is really this goes with the version of Apex you installed. So if you have Apex 4, then you'll need the zip file for Apex 4 and the Apex export class that goes with Apex 4. So that's why I said earlier, make sure that you keep your Apex zip files when you install Apex. And it's going to be a lot easier as a DBA to find your way around instead of trying to figure out which zip file you need to download from OTN to do something. So again, you can run that script and download the whole instance, download specific applications, so on and so forth. So very, very useful. And again, if you want to know more about that, drop me an email or message me on Twitter, and I'll be able to help you out. There's another script that comes with this that's called the Apex Export Splitter. So that's going to take one application export file and split it on different SQL files for all the components of an application, like by pages. So you'll be able to install specific pages only and things like that. When you want to restore your application, simply you need to run the SQL file that's been generated. So it's going to be F and the application ID.SQL. So in that example, 999 would be application ID 999. And then you just run that SQL file in SQL Plus in the schema of the workspace, and it's going to install everything for you based on your export, right? So if you export application ID 999 and you want to import the application into the ID 1, then you need to change the ID before running the script. And for that, there's a API called Apex Application Install, where you can change the workspace ID, the schema name, the application ID, and so on and so forth before running the script. So, so you know, if you want to script your deployments, if you want to script your exports, you can do so. Again, Apex, all it is, it's packages, functions, tables in the database, so everything's accessible through APIs, through SQL Plus, and through PL SQL. Resource Manager. Resource Manager is good if you want to control whoever is running on your database. So if you remember when I started, I talked about a question that what do I do if I have multiple application and I want them to compete against my current production or my application, Apex application, to be putting my database down to its knees? Well, that's how you do that. That's how they do that on the cloud. You can manage CPUs by using Resource Manager, and you can do that with Apex. So if ever there's a long-running process that takes the whole CPU of the whole server, then the Resource Manager, you'll be able to allocate that to and then switch it from one priority to other priority groups, and then eventually get this killed so it doesn't affect the rest of the database. So something to look at. You can configure that at the CDB, PDB level. Basically, what you need to do is you create a consumer groups. In that example, I have Apex IA, which is going to take 70%, the other one 20 and one 10. And then you can create resource plan directives, and then you can assign those consumer groups to the Oracle users. And then every session that's going to start, then there'll be starting with I, and then after such amount of time or after so many CPUs, they're going to switch to medium and then to low and then get killed. So really something great to know about, but that is available only in enterprise editions, I think. So something to be aware of. But if you run in production and you want to make sure, I really think that's something you should always configure to avoid any problems at your database level. And that's not a Apex feature; it's a database feature, and it's really great. And 12.2, there's even more flexibility that you can do with Resource Manager. So really something that you need to have a look at. Since Apex 5, you can assign consumer groups to a workspace straight from Apex, and it's a lot easier to maintain there. Monitoring. I have 10 minutes left, so I'll go fast. Since there's stateless connection, and it's all Apex public user accessing your database, there's a parameter you can put at the end of your Apex URL called p_trace equals yes, and that's going to generate a trace file on your database destination. So you can go there and do tracing, because an Apex session might be using different database connections, because it uses the connection once it renders and processes the page. But then if you do another call to the database, it might be using a different database session. So you cannot trace database sessions directly. You need to do that at the URL level. Just be aware that you need to turn some tracing on, because it's not on by default. And of course, you don't want that on in a production instance. So you want to turn it on by setting the debug to yes and the trace to yes. Sessions, if you want to know what the Apex session is running in the database, you have to look at the module client info and client identifier from the vSession. So module will tell you which Apex app is running that Oracle sessions, which ID, which page, which session number, so on and so forth. So by just looking at the vSessions, you'll be able to know what's the Apex session, what version of Apex, what's the schema running, what's the Apex app ID, what's the page running, what's the session. So with all of this information, you're able to go back into the Apex views and see what's going on. So that's really the trick to monitor your sessions. There's a work database monitor utility available in Apex itself. It's available from the workshop utilities. You can turn that on or off. It's basically a screen like that you'll get all the sessions, like a DBA monitoring tool, and then you can do explain plans, see database session, kill them, and so on and so forth. You need a DBA Oracle user to log into that. But again, that's something that when you're logged into internal, you can turn on, and then you log into the workspace admin, and then you'll be able to get to that workspace database monitor activity screen. You can also run queries. So this query is going to give you elapsed time and give you which page takes a lot of time, so on and so forth. So there are some views for monitoring. So on the administration part and talking about Apex views, there is a global dictionary called Apex Dictionary, and it's going to tell you all the Apex views. So really something you need to know about. There's tons of information in there. You can build your own Apex application on those views and do your own monitoring tools. I know a lot of DBAs that does such a thing. So if you have multiple databases you need to manage and you want to monitor Apex applications, you can build your own Apex apps. For example, that's a query in the workspace schemas views. It's going to tell me, which workspace I have in this instance, which schemas, what date and time they've been created, and so on and so forth. So Apex views is very important. When you install Apex, you also get different database scheduled jobs. So I'm not going to go through them, but just be aware there are 4 of them. And I've got a question saying, when do session becomes invalid? Well, either when you log out, but also when this purge session comes in, it's going to delete all the old sessions and then expire them. There are APIs to administer if you're running in runtime, even if you're not, to manage your instance. So instead of logging into internal, you can run this API, Apex Instance Admin. You can do most of the admin tasks in there and change your Apex install. There's also an Apex Administrator role, database role that you can grant. So with this role, you see all the workspaces, all the information across all the workspaces. So when you query an Apex view from a schema, if this is a schema that has been connected to one workspace, then you'll see only the information from that workspace in the Apex views, right? So there's some security. You cannot query everything across all workspaces. So if you want to do so, or if you want to admin Apex, then you need that role. EBS, quickly, just make sure that when you install Apex with EBS, you install it beside. So ORDS should be installed in its own application server. So in that case, the dotted line is for Apex request. It goes through ORDS and then it goes to the same database. So you install Apex in the EBS database, but you use a separate listener, a separate web server for Apex. The reason is you want to make sure that if there's any maintenance that needs to be done on the EBS side, you're not going to impact the Apex installation, and the other way around. If you need to upgrade Apex, you don't have to worry about your EBS install. At the database level, we usually recommend to use the XX schema and then again install your Apex engine in the same database as EBS. Yeah, so just so you can access your schemas and you can access your packages and everything that needs to be done. That's exactly, we also do the same when forms is used or OAF. And of course, install your XX views package and functions to the app schemas and the XX table sequence synonyms and to your XX schema and use views and use APIs to access EBS data. So the great thing about using Apex to extend, it's really the best tool for that because you don't have to worry about EBS upgrades and EBS patches anymore, and you get all those great new features with reports, interactive reports and graphs and whatnot. And the great thing is if you need to upgrade your extensions and your Apex applications, you don't have to patch EBS at all. So it's very, very fast. And again, if you need to patch EBS, then you don't have to worry about your customized extensions because they're not in EBS anymore, they're in Apex. And we have different solutions for that. At Insum, we developed a lot of APIs and single sign-ons and all of this. So go on our website, there's a EBS section, and you'll get all the info about that. The cloud, there's different options for Apex. Like I mentioned earlier, Apex has been cloud ready since day one, and it's really easy to deploy application in the cloud from your on-premise installation. You just export and then you just import that to the cloud. There's already platform as a service available, and you can use a compute cloud, the infrastructure as a service, and it's also possible to use Amazon and Azure. They're both supported by Oracle. There's just now a bit pricier. I think Oracle changed their pricing, just something to be aware of. But we've started to use the Oracle Cloud more and more now, and that works pretty good. So on the Oracle Cloud, you have the free cloud called apex.oracle.com. There's the infrastructure, which is called the compute cloud, where you can deploy basically you can move your own licenses there and use it there. But the platform as a service, there's database cloud service, which is a database in the cloud. When you install that, it installs Apex by default for you in the database. You can use Exadata Express. It's pretty cheap. It's $175 a month, and you get PDB basically in the cloud. You get only one workspace, but you can create as many schemas as you want, and you get Apex 5.0 pre-installed. In Europe, I think now it's 5.1, so something to have a look at. But you get also Enterprise Edition at that price with all the most of the options not for free, but included in your pricing. And there's a database schema cloud service, which is a bit like apex.oracle.com, but that you can use. And also just be aware that in the BI cloud service, there's also an Apex installation there that you can use with your BI data and manage your BI data in the cloud using Apex. So I'm pretty much straight on time. So on summary, just make sure that you really, as a DBA, something that you need to be aware of is the architecture. Everything's based on that. It's pretty simple. It works well. It runs. You don't have anything complicated to use. If you want to use Apex right away, you don't need really anything more than what you have. You have a database, maybe a small Tomcat running, and then there you go. So it's pretty simple to start to use Apex, pretty simple to use, and very simple to maintain as a DBA. Look at Oscar if you want to do quick deployment on the cloud or anywhere else. Make your backups. Make sure that you clean up after installing or upgrading Apex. That's going to give you a bit more space. Use a very separate table space for your Apex install. See if you want to monitor session, take a look at the module, client info, client identifier. Use the Apex views, learn about them, look at them, know what there is in there, build your own Apex app on this. It's very useful. You can go to the cloud tomorrow morning. It works great, and there's a lot of Apex offering on the cloud. And again, if you want to have more details or more information about everything that I've talked about and more, go and look at the admin book. Really, I based my webinar today on the book. We also have a lot of blogs, and I'll be blogging about cloud in the coming weeks. So keep an eye on that. And again, Twitter. If you want to reach out to me, that's the best place. I'll be there. So, Jason, do we have any questions, or do we have time for questions?
Yeah, maybe we'll take a few. There's two that were asked at the beginning of the session, so I'll just send them over to you, Francis. How does the Apex engine know about the session? Let us say when a session ends or becomes invalid.
Okay, so all the session management is actually maintained in an Apex, in the Apex metadata. So that's how Apex knows about sessions. So in the URL, you'll see that when you call an Apex page, you'll see a long number in the URL. That's actually your Apex session ID. And then that's how Apex knows, and then all the timeouts, and the engine will be keeping all your information and session info. Like, for example, if you have data from one page to the other, or variables or items that you need to get back to, it's all stored in your session information. And then the timeout and everything is also handled from that internal table. You don't actually have a view of that because it's all hidden or all in your metadata, but that's where it's actually maintained. So that's why if ever there's a failover, you fail over to your standby and everything, all those sessions are still going to be there. You won't have to replay any transactions or anything. Another thing I would like to say is that the information in your session can be encrypted also. So if you don't want your DBA to have access to that info, you can select encryption at the, I think that's at the application level, and then that's going to be encrypted in your session.
Okay, just maybe a few more. Do you have time, Francis?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Okay, Rob asks, is the builder and the development tools the same thing?
Yes. So when I talked about the builder and the development tool, to me, it's the exact same thing. So those applications, they're actually Apex applications. So when you run Apex, you'll see in the URL, that's an Apex URL, and then you'll see the application ID. You can actually upload the Apex application in Apex itself. I know some people that did that. But yeah, so the builder and the development tool is exactly the same thing.
Great. Deepa asks, can we have a friendly URL in Apex rather than the long URLs?
That's a very good question. Right now, there are a few. One thing I didn't mention is that there's a very big community with Apex, so there's a lot of information out there. If you go on apex.world, or if you go on the forums and can ask a question there, it's very active. And there are people that did develop some ways of having friendly URLs. Nothing out of the box, nothing really simple. You can do a mod rewrite in Apache, for example. Some others use web services to create those friendly URLs. But quite frankly, at Insum for 13 years, we never did use those friendly URLs. It works pretty good. If it's for engine, like for Google bots and those kind of things, and you want to avoid having the session ID for public sessions in Apex, you can use a session 0. So your URL will always be the same, no matter what's calling it. So that's something maybe to look at, but this is only for public pages. So once you start using Apex, and if you look at what's out there, or you go to Amazon, for example, you'll get those crazy long URLs anyway. So we never had really any issues with long URLs. But I understand that question comes back quite often. I don't know if the Apex team is planning on doing anything with that, but so far it has not been an issue for us.
Okay, one sec. Hala asks, when I want to set some privileges to my application user, should I use a database or Apex?
So, if you want to set database privileges to, you said to the database user?
You said, when I want to set some privileges to my application user, should I use the database or Apex?
That's a good question. So it depends what you mean by privileges. So if you want to, just like I mentioned earlier, an Apex application user is not a database user. So you have to see it as it's your application that's going to be doing the work, no matter what user. So if you want to, for example, be able to access something else at the database level, you'll have to give that to the schema, that privilege, if you want to run a stored procedure or things like that. So it's the application that's going to get the privilege by, because like I said, you have one database user assigned or schema assigned to an application. And then the application users themselves, you manage the security or privileges at the application level. So there's something called authorization in an Apex application, and that's where you say, okay, this user is an admin, or this user has read-only rights, or this user can do this or can do that. And then with those authorization schemes, then you can decide, okay, he has access to that page, right button, or whatever else you want him to have access. So there's really a different approach. I know that with, for example, Oracle Forms, you would have to create one database user, and every user connecting to the application, it's actually a real database user. But with Apex, it's really, you have to see it as application users which don't have privileges at the database level. They have privileges at the application level. And then you have database users, which the applications uses, and those have different database privileges. I hope that answers your question, but that's the best way I can explain that.
Avisna asks, will it work with Oracle VPD?
Yes. So great question. VPD is definitely supported with Apex 100%, and it works very well. We did that for some of our projects, and yes, it is.
Rob asks, what's the easiest way to log what users have accessed the application and when?
There is some internal views in Apex that will give you all of this information. It's called Apex Activity Log, if I remember correctly. But there are views, Apex views, that will tell you what IP address was used, what page was accessed, even how much time, and all of this information. So you can track back. So you can use that information from Apex to log and find everything that's been done in a page. Or you can build your own also. If it's very specific to your application, then you have to build it using triggers and things like that.
Okay, I have another question. How do we enable report printing?
In the internal configuration, quickly, Apex supports by default Oracle BI Publisher. So, but you can also report printing using another tool called AOP, which is a third party, or you could use, and some people use open source. There's different reporting approaches, but if you use BI Publisher or FOP, there are some configuration you need to do at the internal level. So you go log in as internal, and by heart, I don't know exactly where, but if you go in the instance configuration, you'll be able to set up the report server there, and that's how you configure that.
If item images are a part of my application, can I store them in the database for easy content management?
Great question. So in 5.0, you can now, they changed the way that images are being used. So before 5, we never really recommended storing images in your Apex images because it would have to go and hit the database every time those images would be displayed. So sometimes it's good to have them because they're kind of variable, but if it's for a logo, for example, or some fixed images, we used to recommend to put them always at the web listener, web server. If you use images and your applications are specific to like a report, like for example, a product image or something like that, then you can store that in a blob or anything else. But now in Apex 5, you can store also your Apex application images into the image portion of it in shared components. And Apex actually gonna make sure that the browser caches it and then makes it more efficient to use them. So in short, starting from 5.0, you can use no problem the images in the shared components. Works very good. It makes it a lot easier also to deploy your applications, like in the cloud or everywhere else. You don't have to worry about your application images anymore. So I guess we'll take a last question, Jason.
Yeah, maybe the last one. Is there a way for versioning Apex applications?
Another good question. So versioning, if you go on insum.ca/blogs, there's a nice blog that Martin D'Souza wrote about source versioning of your application. But there are different ways of doing so. But since everything's stored in the metadata, it's really a different approach. So there are multiple ways of, it really depends on what you would like to do. So if it's for going back or if something went wrong and you want to go back, There's flashback functionalities in Apex that you can use and re-import, from a flashback. Or what we do at InSum is every time a developer deploys or finishes an application, we check them into SVN, and then you get your history there. So you get to be able to do not only this, but go back a version, and so on and so forth. So long answer, yes. A short answer, you need to understand better what you're trying to do, and then find the best way to do so. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, I think we've just run out of time, so we are hopefully able to answer most of the questions. I know there's a few left over, but if you didn't get your answer question, feel free to just reach out to us on our website, or just tweet at Francis, or even email Francis, and we can answer some of these questions. Also, just to reiterate to everyone, we will be sending the recording of the webinar about a week after, and alongside with the PowerPoint slides as well. So for anyone that is requesting or asking for them, you'll see them in your inbox just about a week from now. So other than that, thanks for tuning in. Francis, do you have any other maybe exiting words?
Yeah, so again, if you want to meet with us and ask your questions and everything, we'll be at Kscope this year. So don't feel free, and don't hesitate to come to us and ask your questions. And thank you for attending my webinar. Hopefully that's been useful to you all. So and on that, well, have a great day. And again, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.